when Bob Moses came up with this idea for Mississippi Freedom Summer, there were activists who said, we don't want all those white kids, all those white college students coming down here. Essentially they were saying this is a black movement, and we can't let that. I mean, that would just really damage us and damage the empowerment of these local black people to have all these smart white kids from the north to come down, and they would feel like the white kids were telling them what to do and so on. And Bob Moses said, he said we're not going to be racist. He said we're not going to be racist. This is not going to be a racist movement. He saw that as racist.
Interesting.
And he said that to these really tough organizers black organizers that he was working with. One person who agreed with him, because he was in the minority, one person who strongly agreed with him was Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, it's got to be inclusive. We got to bring those white kids down here. We've got to show them what it's like here in Mississippi. We've got to spread the message across the country. So he won that battle, but he had to stand up and basically accuse his comrades who had risked their lives and of being racist, and so the anti-racist step for him was to make this an inclusive movement, a black and white movement. The idea that SNCC, as it later became, a separatist movement under Stokely Carmichael, that was just anathema to him. One of the reasons he left SNCC, because he considered that to be racist. So he really, he was really willing always to stand up for some very controversial beliefs, and that was part of his courage as well. It wasn't just in the face of white supremacists, standing up to white supremacists who were trying to kill him, but standing up to black activists who had this, moral absolutism, and who insisted on an all-black movement, sort of the black nationalist perspective, which is very understandable, but wouldn't get us anywhere and didn't get us anywhere. And so it has to be more inclusive.
And you're trying to give the young people something that will help them, yet you don't know exactly what it ought to be.
Hello again, and thanks for tuning into the podcast once again. My name is Drew Perkins, and I'm the Director of TeachThought Professional Development, and I'm happy to have you join us for what we try to do, which is to have heterodox and complex and interesting and sometimes difficult conversations about things that will hopefully help you as an educator better prepare students for the modern world. Speaking of preparing students for the modern world, our professional development services are, of course, all geared towards that, and everything that we do is through the lens of inquiry and personalized to meet the needs of you and your school and your district. So if you are looking for ways to better prepare your students for the modern world, please navigate on over to wegrowteachers.com, where you'll find our workshops and our services, including project-based learning, differentiated instruction, and a whole host of inquiry-centered and student-focused professional development options for your school. In this episode, I spoke with Stewart Burns, who is an historian and specializes in civil rights and social justice. Stewart is currently a professor at Union Institute and University, which is in the Cincinnati, Ohio area, but offers 100% online classes. And you can find more information by going to myunion.edu. We talked about the Social Justice Institute that they are developing and some of the ways in which they are offering certificates and education opportunities for folks who might be interested, so I would encourage you to visit that. And we talked a lot about the civil rights educator and activist Bob Moses, who, as you'll hear, I was only peripherally aware of and knowledgeable about his work. So I tried to enter this conversation from that perspective, as I would imagine many of you who are listening as educators and perhaps non-educators might only be peripherally aware of his work as well. And we talked about him in sort of the context of Martin Luther King Jr., not to pit them against each other, but to use that as sort of a canvas, and the ways in which they are similar and the ways in which they are different, and perhaps why Bob Moses is less well-known, certainly, than Martin Luther King Jr. We talked about his work and how it leans into and is resonant with lots of the work that we do of inquiry, but also in the context of sort of classic liberalism and liberal science, and the ways in which we really might think about the shared common humanity traits that we all have in juxtaposition with the ways in which we might be different, whether that's in immutable characteristics or not. So again, a really fascinating conversation. It went fairly long because I thought it was really interesting, or at least interesting to me, and I hope it was interesting and useful to you. Well, welcome everybody. We are live and recording. I'm with Stewart Burns, who is going to tell us and inform us and enlighten us on the civil rights educator and activist Bob Moses, of which is a namesake of my uncle, but that's neither here nor there. Always makes me sort of chuckle when I hear his name and think of my Uncle Bob. But regardless, Stewart, I want to give you an opportunity, as I usually do, to introduce yourself and give our listeners a little bit of context for the work that you do, and perhaps how you got into diving into the work of and life of Bob Moses, so that our listeners can be a little more informed as they're listening as well.
Great. Well, I'm very happy to be here, and I really appreciate the invitation. It's great to have this opportunity. I am a professor of ethical and creative leadership in the interdisciplinary PhD program, and I chair that department at Union Institute and University. I also teach in our Martin Luther King Jr. Legacies Studies, which is unique in the world. And I'm a scholar of King. I wrote a biography called To the Mountaintop that came out some years ago, and I just had a revised edition come out. My specialty is the Black freedom movement and social movements in the United States generally, and a few other things as well. But I also have been a nonviolent activist for most of my life, and was involved very peripherally in the civil rights movement myself as a very young boy. I attended the March on Washington in August 1963, and I started a civil rights committee in my high school at the age of 14. But mainly I was involved in the anti-war movement. I was a draft resistor, as Bob Moses was, and then became a scholar after being heavily involved in the movements of the 1960s. Bob Moses was always a great hero of mine. And in fact, as one of the leaders of SNCC, the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, which he started out with in 1960, SNCC was critical of King. Although they revered him, they were very critical of him. And I shared, when I was younger, I shared that critique of King as sort of not being radical enough, not being courageous enough. And that has changed, I must say, after studying his life. But Bob Moses was a lot of people, a lot of historians feel, Taylor Branch, for example, a lot of historians feel that next to Dr. King, Bob Moses was the most important leader of the civil rights movement, of the Black freedom movement, because it was really his creation and deep involvement and leadership of the Mississippi freedom movement that was as important as anything else in achieving voting rights, achieving the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And I was fortunate to be an editor of the King papers at Stanford University. And when I was there, Bob Moses would came by a few times. And so I got to know him pretty well from those visits during the 1990s. And then in the 2000s, I was a professor at Williams College in Western Massachusetts, near where I am now. I taught leadership and history there. And I brought Bob Moses twice to Williams College. And that's where I really worked with him, because he doesn't just come to speak somewhere. In fact, he doesn't try to speak that much at all. He tries to listen and ask questions. And so he came in 2005 and again in 2010 as part of his new movement, which, this is jumping ahead, but his new movement, which was a campaign for quality education as a constitutional right, effort to actually pass and ratify a constitutional amendment guaranteeing every child, every young person, a quality education, not just K through 12, but through college as well. This has not gotten very far yet, as you could imagine.
Certainly not.
But this was his later legacy was this movement. So we actually had mass meetings, so-called, like they did in the old days. We had a mass meeting at Williams College of students where the purpose was not just to hear Bob Moses talk about this campaign, but to actually do it, actually get students involved in organizing, because that's what he's always been all about. And then in 2010 as well, it was to get students involved. And sometimes people would be frustrated, teachers that he's worked with, students that he's worked with, people that the places I brought him would be disappointed because he doesn't give a speech. He draws out questions from people. He will ask questions, or if they ask questions to him, he will turn them back and turn the question back to them. And they often don't know what to say,
right.
but they need to say something. So that's very briefly my background with him. And I got to know him quite well and really feel like we were friends, because I just spent so much time with him. I mean, one time when he came to Williams, I picked him up in Cambridge, Massachusetts, drove him all across the state to Williams College, whole 12-hour day at Williams College, and then drove him to Albany, New York, to the Albany airport. So it was like total immersion with Bob Moses. So I got to know him quite well, and I just have the greatest respect and love for him. And he, lived up to every expectation that I had of him.
Well, there's several places in which I can imagine going from here. And as we were talking before we started recording, one of the things I shared was, and now especially as the way that you've described him, because I am similarly, when I'm certainly not comparing myself to him and his work, but in the scope and scale and importance of it. But when I get requests sometimes for, doing a keynote, which I'm happy to come and talk for 20 minutes or something if that's what you want to do. But I really try to advocate for, let's make this a session that people can actually think and not just sort of consume. And our work just is we think about professional development, helping teachers improve their work, is always through the lens of inquiry. So thinking about sort of Socratic method and inquiry, and so that resonates. And as I said before, I have only been very peripherally aware of Bob Moses, and now I'm in retrospect thinking, boy, I really feel like I should have and could have learned a lot more. And there's still time for me to learn, even though he's passed. But that the idea of the ways in which he worked really resonate with me. So coming at this conversation with only a fairly, as I said, peripheral understanding of who he is and his work, I think it's hopefully, and as I said before, I think it's probably fairly typical of folks that they are only peripherally aware of him. He certainly doesn't have the notoriety and stature of Martin Luther King Jr. And I'm curious, I suppose it's intuitively easy to figure out in some ways why Martin Luther King was so or is so well known, great orator, and there's certainly some other things. I'm curious, do you have a sense of why Bob Moses is not more well known, if in fact I'm perceiving that correctly?
Yes, well, that's a great question. First of all, King, who I love and revere, was all about making himself the center of attention, because that was a deliberate strategy from the get-go, that when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was founded with him at the head after the success of the Montgomery bus boycott, where he had been the embodiment of the bus boycott, much to the chagrin of the women in particular. The women leaders really were the ones who led that movement and made it happen, because they were the organizers.
Yeah.
And King was not an organizer. He didn't really understand organizing. Ella Baker, the great civil rights leader Ella Baker, who at one point was the executive director of SCLC, the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, was very frustrated working with King, because she was all about organizing. She had been organizing for the NAACP, the National Association for the Advancement of Color People, all around the country since around 1930. She had organized branches of the NAACP. She had, and King was kind of clueless about, well, organizing, what's that? And so she finally left SCLC because she just couldn't make any headway. They failed. She tried to launch a voting rights campaign that would involve community organizing, and the pastors who led the SCLC just couldn't understand, what does she mean, organizing?
Let me stop you there real quick. Just a quick question. In that stage of Martin Luther King Jr.'s life, how old would he have been roughly? Do you have a quick?
Well, he would have been 28 at the end of the 26 when the bus boycott started. 28 at the end of it.
Okay.
But he was, way beyond his years.
Yeah.
And the deliberate strategy, not just of him, but of the other Black leaders around him, was to make him be the star, the media star, all about Dr. King. And as a historian of American social movements, there is not any other movement in American history that I'm aware of that has been so identified with leader. I mean, you could look at just about any movement, labor movement, peace movement. You often hear now, and it's very frustrating to me, it's referred to as Dr. King's movement, Dr. King's movement. Dr. King did this, Dr. King did that, when, it totally ignores the thousands and thousands of people who were the real movers and shakers. So, and I'll just, a way to kind of encapsulate this was that when he first took over the Dexter Avenue Baptist Church in Montgomery, Alabama, before the bus boycott, 25 years old then, he told his parishioners on the first day that he wanted to make it clear that leadership never ascends from the pulpit. Leadership never ascends from the pew to the pulpit. Leadership always descends from the pulpit to the pew. And that was his basic perspective that came out of the Black Baptist Church, the role of the minister. Now, a young girl who was 15 years old who got arrested before the bus boycott started and was really the one who started the bus boycott, named Claudette Colvin, when she was testifying in court during the bus boycott, and she was asked, who the leaders were, she said, our leaders is just we, ourself. And that's the perspective that Bob Moses has, that everyone has the potential to be a leader. No one should be glorified. And they were very critical of how King and his people would come into a city like Birmingham or Selma and make waves, and all the media would be there, and they'd get all this national attention. And then when they achieved some kind of settlement, which was not achieving all their goals, but what others called a half-oath settlement, he and his team and the cameras would leave, and then the city, Birmingham, Selma, would have to kind of pick up the pieces, and without much help from his organization. But he and his involvement had a national impact. It didn't matter so much to them what happened locally. I mean, I'm being a little bit harsh here, but it's basically true that they didn't care so much about what happened to the local movement after they left. It was the national impact, and so they did have an effect on President Kennedy, on the Civil Rights Bill, which became the Civil Rights Act, the voting rights Act, all those things. So it's very important what they did. But what Bob Moses and Ella Baker, his mentor, were concerned about was the local people becoming leaders themselves, and also having to become leaders, especially in rural places like rural Mississippi, like the Mississippi Delta, where whether or not King ever came to town, they were facing day in and day out threats of death, lynching, literally, all kinds of harassment and brutality. And so they had to become leaders. They had no choice. They had to find it within themselves. So Bob Moses and the SNCC people who came to Mississippi, they came with the aim of empowering the local people and the sharecroppers, most of them, to see themselves as leaders, to begin to take action as leaders, to take charge of their own destinies, to take responsibility for registering to vote, in the face, and the only protection they had was from each other. And so Bob Moses created what they called their form of leadership. What Ella Baker called it was group-centered leadership, where the leadership was in the group, not in a charismatic figure who was kind of outside of and above the group. It was all about how you empower local groups to take action. So that was incredibly effective. It took a while. I mean, because this was so new. This was not business as usual. This was a very new way to bring about social change. But the Mississippi movement culminated in Mississippi Freedom Summer in 1964, which Bob Moses directed, and it was kind of his baby. And they brought down up to 1,000 northern students, mostly white, to come down for the summer. The white supremacists of Mississippi saw this understandably as an invasion. I mean, almost like, a new civil war. All these white students coming down from the north. They prepared as if for war. The three organizers, Andy Goodman, Mickey Schwerner, and James Chaney, were killed right at the beginning of the movement. But they managed to create an alternative Democratic Party because the black people were completely excluded from the racist regular Democrats, as they were called, the one party South. So they created an alternative, the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party, and they challenged the regular party for delegates to the Democratic National Convention in Atlantic City, where I actually happened to be, because my father was a delegate from Massachusetts. So I actually was there.
So would that have been, so you're referring to kind of the Solid South, that was, as you mentioned, the way that we think about our parties now is sort of flipped. Was that, in terms of social justice and perceptions of which party, is advocating for civil rights and that kind of thing? Is that what you're describing, sort of the beginning of that shift?
Absolutely.
Okay.
That was when it flipped, which was in some ways good, in some ways not so good. A lot of historians and political scientists have felt that party realignment is generally a good thing, because it means that people from the grassroots are able to get their voices heard in the way that the parties end up realigning. And in this case, one reason that President Johnson was so afraid, terribly afraid, deathly afraid of having, I mean that literally, of having the Mississippi Freedom Democratic Party delegates, which were almost all black delegates, but it was open to whites as well. I mean, it was an integrated delegation. He was afraid that if those delegates, even if just a few of them, were seated in place of the regular Mississippi delegates, that the white supremacist delegates would walk out, that the delegates from Alabama, who were controlled by Governor George Wallace, would walk out, that the Deep South delegations would all walk out, and that he would lose the Solid South, which he had always counted on, being from Texas, and that he might even lose the election, but that at least that he would not win with the kind of majority that he needed in order to enact the kind of changes that he hoped to enact, the great society changes, etc. So he knew, and he said, in the way that he would talk about it, he would say, because his telephone conversations were all recorded, so we actually can hear him, and he can say, he would say, to his cronies, if the Negroes take over the Democratic Party, that's it. That's the death of the Democratic Party. The Republicans are going to take over the South, and sure enough, that's what happened. Particularly after he signed the Civil Rights Act of 1964, and then won, resounding election over Barry Goldwater in '64. The Southern Democrats deserted the Democratic Party in droves, turned to the Republicans, and that's when almost immediately, instead of the solid one-party Democratic South, it became the solid one-party Republican South. And since that time, that was, a complete flip. So since that time, it's now the Democrats in the South who tend to be more pro-civil rights, and the Republicans in the South who are not for civil rights.
I don't want to dwell on this too much because we're here to talk about Bob Moses, but one of the things that I'm curious about, to the extent that you know, and not asking you to be unnecessarily critical or harsh, but when you describe the ways in which Martin Luther King Jr. sort of became the star that he was and is, an icon, was it more a sense of kingmakers pushing him there, or do you think it was driven by him and his desire to do that, or again, to the extent that you know?
It was both. It was both. On the one hand, he clearly felt that he was doing God's will, and that however guilty he might feel about becoming the supreme icon, the embodiment of the movement, he felt tremendous guilt about that. In fact, even to the point where when he received the Nobel Peace Prize in 1964, in December 1964, you would think that would be the great highlight of anyone's life. He was so deeply depressed because of the guilt that he felt. For one thing, specifically because of the 4 girls who were killed in the bombing of the 16th Street Baptist Church in Birmingham on September 15th. We're coming up to the anniversary. September 15th, 1963, which devastated him. Then a year later, when he received the Nobel Peace Prize, the deaths of those girls, and then all the others who had died, and all the others who had sacrificed their lives, and he felt, I don't deserve this. I mean, all I've done is he got arrested a few times and gave a lot of speeches, but he felt tremendous guilt, and he accepted the award in the name of the movement. He gave all the money to the movement, even though his wife, Coretta, wanted the money to be spent on their kids' college education. And his associate, Ralph Abernathy, felt that he should get a cut of it as well. But King gave all the money to the movement. He was tremendously guilty, but he felt that he was doing God's will. This is what God wanted him to do. And so it came partly from him and the church people around him who kept calling him, our Jesus, our Moses, our Amos.
Ironically, our Moses.
Right. Well, that's another thing to mention. And so a lot of it did come from the ministers around him from the Black Baptist Church and others around him who felt an absolute necessity to build up a Black leader because, for one thing, other Black leaders at that time had been tarnished by McCarthyism because of possible, left-wing backgrounds. They were either attacked by McCarthyism or felt they would be, and so there were a lot of Black leaders at the time who couldn't, like A. Philip Randolph, who was the most important Black leader up until King, who was head of the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and was at that time considered the great Black leader, but he was also a democratic socialist, and so now King was a socialist too, but he didn't tell anybody. He kept it to himself. But so there was this great vacuum of leadership, so there are a lot of forces, including liberal whites, including Time magazine, a lot of the liberal media. They all kind of conspired, if you will, create this persona of this great civil rights leader. Which King himself sometimes said, I don't know who this person is. I can't recognize this person. Right. This is somebody else, but also the movement itself, because they had not had a leader, they had not ever, maybe since Frederick Douglass, had a leader who appealed so broadly. There were earlier leaders that were more radical, more left-wing, who couldn't possibly get the support of whites in America, the white majority, whereas King could get the support of the white majority, and he did, at least until he came out against the Vietnam War years later. So it was all, you could say it was overdetermined that he be put on this pedestal.
Yeah. Well, it's interesting as you sort of, as I think about as you're describing, again, asking, part of the reason why I asked Martin Luther King Jr.'s age to try to get a sense of the granular nature of where people are, and that in comparison to looking back on it as history, right, and living in those moments and the various forces at play, and the personalities and desires and all the characteristics of, if we're going to say Martin Luther King Jr. or Bob Moses, and I don't want to pit them against each other, but just as a sort of canvas from which to work, right? Thinking about, it seems to me there are two pieces here, at least two pieces, major pieces of the ways in which Bob Moses may or may not have wanted to be necessarily in the limelight, and or his style of work, and that the way that impacted his, I suppose, notoriety and how much of an icon he is or isn't going forward, and then with that, as you mentioned, the media and the politicians that may or may not have recognized one or the other, or any of the other leaders that you may or may not have mentioned as well. But then looking back, one of the things that is certainly a big part of the conversation right now in education is the things that we do or don't learn in history and in our K-12 and beyond experience, and that includes a tremendous amount of things, right? I mean, any history course has to make choices about what is and what is not taught. I was in France years ago. I sometimes tell this story, and I was talking to a teacher who happened to be French, and she said, "What do you teach?" And I said, "I teach U.S. history." And she literally, sort of jokingly said, "That's a whole course?" Of course, the idea of, you look at some of these ancient countries and their history spans, tremendous amounts of decades and centuries and so on and so forth, whereas U.S. history is fairly short, relatively short. So I'm curious, again, anything else you want to add in terms of the way that he worked and what he thought was important, either in terms of notoriety, things that would have impacted his notoriety and status as a civil rights icon going forward, but then the ways in which history and education and sort of curriculum have impacted those things.
Yes. Well, great question. Bob did not want to be considered a leader, or at least a leader above all the others who he felt were equal leaders, at least potentially. So most of what he did was behind the scenes, one-to-one, a lot of one-to-one conversations with people in small groups, informal groups, where he would try to purvey this philosophy of group-centered leadership, so that when there were larger meetings, mass meetings, or even smaller than that, but whenever there were larger meetings, he would try to make himself invisible, in a sense. He would sit at the back of the room. He would push others up to the front. He would not want to be the spokesperson, because he felt that he would get put into this role that he not only did he personally feel uncomfortable with it, but he felt it would be damaging to the movement to have him in this role as a kind of icon. And also, of course, then if he was killed, which he almost was a number of times, he came very close, then they're left with their leader is gone. So he tried his hardest to not be in the spotlight, but because he was so courageous, there were a number of episodes where, for instance, when he first arrived in Macomb, Mississippi, southwest Mississippi, in the fall of 1961, the sheriff's cousin, he was bringing some people, sharecroppers, to the county courthouse to register to vote, and the sheriff's cousin battered him with his pistol, battered his face, smashed his face. Blood was pouring down. It could have been life-threatening. Blood was pouring down his face. Would Bob Moses stop? No. He kept on going with the sharecroppers that he was leading to the courthouse, walked up the courthouse steps into the registrar's office. The registrar saw Bob Moses with blood, pouring down. Registrar, closed the office. And then on the way home, they were harassed, even more. And then other times, Bob would be in a car where the Klan would shoot into the car, and, he would narrowly escape. So because of his unbelievable courage like, no one had ever seen, even though so many Black people were incredibly courageous, but he kind of stood out. He became a cult of personality developed around him within SNCC, within the SNCC community, and by the sharecroppers, so that even someone like Fannie Lou Hamer, who he was the one, he brought her into the movement, he nurtured her, he brought her into it, and she became the oldest full-time organizer in SNCC in Mississippi. She would call him Little Moses. She would sing. She had a fantastic singing voice, and she would sing about, go down Moses, set my people free. Well, she would say Bob Moses, so he was handicapped by having the last name of Moses. Is exactly what he even changed his name at one point because to his middle name Parris, because he, with a name like Bob Moses, how could you avoid being treated as some kind of godly figure? So he did everything he could to damp down that effort to make him into this kind of heroic icon of the movement. And eventually it kind of drove him out of the movement in 1965. He just felt that with his style of leadership, where he was, as Ella Baker would say, what we're trying to do as leaders is not develop our own leadership, but to develop leadership in other people. It was all about developing leadership in other people, in this case, in the sharecroppers, in the poor people of Mississippi. And so when he saw that the undue attention was being paid to him, that was just the antithesis of what he wanted to represent. But this is a real problem for us now because, as you have said, people don't know about him. I mean, he won a MacArthur Award, for his work in the civil rights. He's gotten all kinds of honors, and he's been written about. Taylor Branch wrote about him very heavily in his book on first volume of his biography of King. But he deliberately has kept himself out of the limelight. So now with his passing, those of us who are trying to honor his legacy, and really grateful to you for giving me this opportunity to try to honor his legacy, we have to kind of start from square one. We have to kind of start, which is good because people need to know this history. And that's where, because the kind of history that I write it to be accessible so that even kids as young as middle school can read my biography of King. I mean, it's designed for adults, but it's written in a way that it's accessible. And so in my biography of King, for example, I write a lot about Bob Moses and about the kind of relationship between the two, the sort of the saying we needed both. We
Yeah.
needed King, absolutely needed King and that style of leadership, but that was necessary but not sufficient. We also needed the SNCC style of leadership that Bob Moses exemplified. And so what actually we're trying to do now at the Institute for Social Justice at Union Institute and University is create a kind of a Bob Moses organizer's toolkit with a whole lot of different resources that can be used not only by organizers but by teachers, even in elementary school, even in middle school, because after the Black Freedom Movement was over, starting in the early 80s, Bob Moses dedicated himself to teaching algebra. He was a his field was the philosophy of math. He got his PhD finally at Harvard in the philosophy of mathematics. And so he really felt that math literacy was the civil rights issue of certainly the 21st century. It still is. That during the time of the civil rights movement, it was literacy, reading and writing literacy, because for one thing, Black people couldn't vote in certain places unless they had some literacy.
Right.
But generation later, it's all about literacy in mathematics, STEM, STEM literacy. And so he became a great champion of that, but he applied the methods of the Black Freedom Movement, of SNCC, in teaching math and getting kids to be in low income inner city areas to be excited about math, because he showed how math could be understood through their own personal experience, through their own thinking about how they lived their lives. And so he would teach about algebra in the algebra, what he called the Algebra Project, through getting kids to think about, let's say in Cambridge, Massachusetts, or Boston, riding the subway, the distances that they would go, the stops, the duration, all those things that were mathematical concepts, but the kids would understand them through their experience riding the subway or riding the buses, because that's what they knew. That was part of their culture.
Contextualized.
And then he would have them reflect on it and write about it, not in terms of mathematical equations. This is algebra, he's teaching algebra, but not to write about in terms of algebraic equations, but to actually write about the concepts of algebra first in their own language, and then in a more sophisticated language, and then as symbolic representations that would come out of their own experience of, it wouldn't be, in other words, rather than sort of deductive knowledge coming from the principles up there, it would be inductive knowledge coming from the kids themselves, their own culture, their own experience. And then from that, they would come up, and so there'd be kind of a matching of the kids' own experience with the principles of mathematics.
So the question that comes to my mind as you're describing that, and I also I'd like to ask you this, but also before I forget it, because I'm afraid I'm going to forget it, the ways in which Bob Moses sort of became less in the limelight, and his approach to sort of distributed leadership and local control and sustainability and capacity building. First again, so I don't forget it, is, do you think that he maybe later in life had some reflective regret on that, perhaps, and the impact of his work and the effectiveness of his work in that context? But then also, one of the things that again piqued my interest at the beginning of our conversation was his really heavy emphasis on inquiry that you mentioned, which is very resonant with us. And when we think about preparing students for the modern world, one of the things we really focus on, and I do think that this is a tool if we talk about social justice and building capacity in folks, bootstraps or whatever you want to say, helping those folks who are trying to move up in social and economic class, that inquiry and problem solving and critical thinking is a tremendous piece of that. The math and the STEM being perhaps a bit more pragmatic and utilitarian of getting jobs, which is important certainly, but it's not the only thing. It's like, how do we make sure that we give these students opportunities to develop those skills of identifying the important questions and doing something well, or whether that's buying a house or choosing an educational path or, you name it. So 2 questions there. One about whether he reflectively thought maybe he should have been a bit more aggressive in taking some of the limelight or some version of that. And then the question about inquiry.
Right. Well, what he did was he applied inquiry in areas where it wasn't usually, even to this day, as far as I know, but you know far more than I, not yet applied. So that he would apply inquiry to mathematics. So it would all be about critical thinking in relation to these mathematical concepts. It would be about the students. We talked about how you have to start with a child's idea of what a number means, and then see what questions the child would have about numbers, even apart from mathematical principles. That it was all about getting the kids to ask questions, to interrogate these issues, and through that process get motivated. Part of it was because I had a lot of trouble with algebra when I was, myself. I wish I had the algebra project. I really do. But because he got the kids excited about the concepts of math, then it was an easier step to get into the nitty-gritty of, the actual equations. And so by getting kids excited about, how algebra related to taking a subway ride or something in their personal life, then they'd be in a position to go deeper. And then when they started thinking about equations and that sort of thing, they really had a grasp of it and they were excited. And so the kids who would not have done well at all on the math tests in those grades suddenly did really well on those math tests, and they were taking algebra in 8th grade, even 7th grade. They were advanced, in those areas, because as you know, and I think all educators know, it's all about motivation. And so Bob would really get kids motivated. I mean, they would be so excited about this. And part of it was, he found teachers who had those skills. I mean, he was able to draw together teachers who at first were scared about this stuff, and then this way of teaching algebra. And then once they got the hang of it, they became true believers. And so inquiry was not only for, humanities and so forth. Inquiry was very much, he felt that if kids are really going to be knowledgeable and trained in the hard sciences, they have to approach it with a spirit of inquiry, and that's what he cultivated. In terms of whether he would have had regrets, I don't think he would have had regrets. For one thing, he had this patience that maybe you could call it strategic patience. He was willing to wait. Now, a lot of us don't feel like we can afford to wait with climate change and racial justice, inequality. But somehow he felt that we could take the time. He would talk about, generational changes. And so he truly believed that these seeds that he planted would, and the way you see kind of the exponential growth of the algebra project, so that within just a few years, there were thousands and thousands and thousands of kids in hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of schools, who were learning algebra through the Algebra project in those schools. But the other thing to say is that he and the values that he represented with SNCC, more than anybody else in SNCC, really not just planted the seeds, but kind of inspired other movements that grew, like the feminist movement. The feminist movement. There were feminists in SNCC who were unhappy with how they were being treated in this movement that was supposed to be for equality, and so they kind of broke off and formed these feminist consciousness-raising groups. The same principle of group-centered leadership. Participatory democracy, that idea of participatory democracy, that came right out of Bob Moses and the SNCC experience. And so you have all these movements that arose, the gay and lesbian liberation movement, and the environmental movement, these movements that all kind of grew out of that SNCC conception of group-centered leadership. Black Lives Matter today, they say their inspiration was Ella Baker in particular, and group-centered leadership. I mean, they actually talk in those terms. So whatever you think of different ways that it's been manifested in recent years and decades, the philosophy of group-centered leadership, sort of, democracy in the streets, or, participatory democracy, the student movement, Students for Democratic Society, they were heavily influenced by Bob Moses. And so they came up with the Port Huron Statement, which was all about participatory democracy. That came right out of SNCC. So he knew that he had a tremendous influence in spawning these other movements that grew out of SNCC.
Yeah. So the sort of idea of patience, which does, or I think is very compatible with an inquiry-based, organic, the ways in which we think about teaching and learning, and sometimes we do lots of work in project-based learning. So developing what are the questions we need to know and learn in order to do this, meet this challenge, answer this what we call driving question. There's sometimes what we call a tension, or I say a friction, between lots of our schools and the ways in which you have rigid curriculum and pacing guides and common assessments and all these things, versus a more organic. And I sometimes talk about it in terms of a spectrum, right? That there's very, very rigid, and then there's sort of free school, which is adults just supervising kids finding their own passions. But it reminds me in some ways of that sort of patience versus the urgency. And as you mentioned, some of the ways in which we see some of the work in social justice manifesting itself now, I'm reminded of some of those movements and some of those leaders and some of the most vocal folks in some of those movements. And there's just this, it seems like a friction point between that sense of urgency that we, and even some folks who would sort of offer the idea that we haven't really made much progress since, the 60s or something like that, which, curious to hear your thoughts on that. Seems patently untrue to me. I mean, clearly we have lots of work to do, but have made significant progress in lots of ways. Yes. So I'm curious, I'm assuming you are, probably maybe even know Clarence Jones from Martin Luther King Jr.'s legal advisor and confidant, and so on and so forth. One of his pushbacks on the ethics, the curriculum in California, I'm drawing a blank on the actual name of it, but one of the things that he pushed back quite vehemently was the omission of Dr. King's work in some of those, at least formative documents and curriculum pieces. I don't know where that ended up, but I'm curious how you see any sort of tension or compatibility with some of the more recent and perhaps more vocal contemporary social justice advocates and activists in terms of that urgency. And are they, like 1619 Project, for example, being, perhaps the most notable right now, which is not the only thing, and it's not representative of all of those different folks, but there seems to be some real tension between what it should be taught and what should not be taught, and how it should be taught. So I'm curious what your thinking is, and especially in the context of Bob Moses and the way that he thought about education.
Yes, well, those are great thoughts and great questions. Clarence Jones is a controversial figure because he notwithstanding his great contributions, especially with he was played an important role in King's "I Have a Dream" speech, except that the most important part of the speech was not written ahead of time. But he tends to have a different interpretation of King than a lot of us do, King scholars. He's actually been criticized as in fact, one of my colleagues, Lewis Baldwin, who I consider the best King scholar, wrote a book criticizing, in effect, even in the title, about how Clarence Jones was trying to domesticate King. Clarence Jones did not really support King's, for instance, his opposition to the Vietnam War, his more radical stands about economic justice, Poor People's Campaign. He really wanted King. He wanted the King of the March on Washington to be the King that people would remember. So he has what I would call kind of a conservative take on King. And so while I feel I'm not familiar with what you mentioned about Jones pushing the curriculum change in California, but I would be concerned that the portrayal of King that he would want to be part of the curriculum might be not the portrayal that I would want them to see. That it would be King as all about judging kids not by the color of their skin but by the content of their character. Well, that's important, but it goes far beyond King's philosophy. Goes far beyond that, and really is a critique, a systemic critique. A critique of systemic racism, systemic poverty, and so forth. And so that's one thing, is that it's not just to have King more present in the curriculum, it's to have the full King of the King who lived 5 more years after the March on Washington and moved to a more radical perspective on the systemic changes that needed to happen, even questioning corporate capitalism. So that's part of it. But also, I worry about, even if it is a so-called correct interpretation of King, that still it puts King too much at the center. There has to be a balance. It can't just be curriculum about Dr. King's movement. It has to be, that this movement involved, thousands and thousands of leaders, and the SNCC approach, the SNCC experience, and all the other activists who were not top down but rather bottom up, they have to get their due. They have to, it has to be both. It has to be both. So now, what was the second part?
Well, again, the sort of tension, or at least as I see it, I mean, as we talked a bit before we started recording there, and to the extent that you're aware of it, I don't know, but there have been some controversy around, math as social justice, and that there's, white supremacy in math, or I don't know the details of enough of it to really speak well informed, but seeing it from a distance, that math is a tool of white supremacy or something, which strikes me is a friction point with the way that Bob Moses might have thought about algebra and the importance of math. But just then in a larger sense of like the sense of like what we should be teaching and what we are teaching, the Tulsa Race Massacre being the latest version, like everybody who didn't hear about that and learn about that, you say, well, why are we not teaching that? Well, there's lots of things we're not teaching just by the fact that we have to choose some things and not choose other things. So I'm curious, again, just that your thoughts and the way that he might have or did talk about or think about those tensions, especially in terms of the ways that some of the more vocal and perhaps more urgently called to activists might be pushing those agendas or thoughts.
Right. Oh, that's very, very important. I think my sense is that those activists, let's say African American activists, who are critical of, who might see math as, something that represents the establishment and particularly white supremacy, I think that what they're responding to is how poorly math has been taught. It's if you teach algebra the traditional way, which Bob was so concerned about, it turns them off right away. And so you could see that as not the content of the math, but just the process of teaching math in inner city schools by teachers who are mostly white, teaching black kids. Black kids don't have a clue, about what they're talking about, and it could seem like something that it's almost like it's being taught intentionally to confuse them and to keep them from getting access to it. Now that may be kind of a strong way of putting it, but as a historian of social movements and as someone on the left, I'm acutely aware of how every social movement, but I'll just speak, the ones on the right, I won't talk about those, but the ones on the left, they all have what I call moral excesses. And what you're pointing to is what I would consider a moral excess of the Black freedom movement, the Black liberation movement. I think it's probably a very small minority, I hope, of activists who would have that position about math. But although I can understand where it's coming from, but that's the kind of thing that it's so important to make these crucial distinctions. And there's this famous slogan by Audre Lorde, the Black poet Audre Lorde, that you can't use the master's tools to dismantle the master's house. And so some people take that a little bit too literally. And so anything that the white man, so to speak, has imposed on African Americans in the past is to be questioned and perhaps dismissed. And I just think that's a dangerous road to take, especially when it comes to technology. So Bob would have a very opposite position on that. In fact, he would be fighting that. What he was doing was, very much an effort to go against that particular. I almost consider it kind of a nihilistic approach. He would say, absolutely, Black kids, Latino kids, they have to learn this math, but they have to learn it in their own way. They have to learn it in a way that they can understand it. They have to learn it, as something that can be socially constructed by them and their teachers in language that they can understand. So he would be, very much.
Which I would say is not unique to African Americans. I mean, that is true of all of us as we learn that making meaning of things in context and as you mentioned, it's not something that only Black kids can make meaning of things that way, right?
It's the only way to learn. I mean, it's how I teach with my students, my PhD students and undergraduates. I taught undergraduates for a long time. So yes, it's crucial, the spirit of inquiry that you talk about. But what I thought you were going to ask about, and maybe it was going to be the next question, is in terms of this huge controversy now about critical race theory and how critical race theory has been so utterly misinterpreted by people on the right, and what people on the right are doing is they're trying to confuse critical race theory with teaching about race and racism, and sort of implying that critical race theory covers all those efforts to teach about race and racism in a new way.
Right.
And so they're trying to prohibit, through prohibiting critical race theory, they're also trying to prohibit any serious discussion of systemic racism and white supremacy, and these are related, of course, but they're really two different things. And so I really don't think there are many elementary or middle school or even high school teachers who are teaching about critical race theory per se.
Right.
But they are beginning to teach more and more about racism as systemic.
Right.
And the thing about that is that if you teach about racism as being systemic, then white people hopefully don't have to feel the guilt about it, because they can see it's true. This is not about me. This is about a system that was created by white supremacists, a century ago or more, and I'm victimized by it too. Heather McGhee's new book, The Sum of Us, about how white supremacy, racism has hurt white people, almost as much as it's hurt black people. It's it's devastating in all kinds of ways. So to not teach about systemic racism really is harmful to white people as well, because they're not going to understand why they're struggling, why inequality is so extreme, and all these other things. Why public spending is so down compared to other times in U.S. history. So white people are shooting themselves in the foot when they try to stop schools from teaching about racism, because it's only by understanding racism that all of us will be able to break through and come to understand what our society really is about and how we can transform it in a way that benefits all of us.
Yeah, well, it strikes me, and I don't want to linger too much on critical race theory because it's just become almost tiresome in the public discussion. And to your point, it's been sort of distorted. I would say in some ways on both right and left, and in the ways that it's sort of conflated and there's derivatives. But it strikes me as that as to your point, and what I've said is, and I get a chance to work in schools around the country and some places around the world, and I say that the places in which you might see critical theory or critical race theory actually being taught, it just really doesn't make sense that any of that's explicit teaching of the theory in any of our K-12, perhaps maybe in a sociology class in high school or something like that, but there's no place for a fifth grade teacher to be teaching the tenets of critical race theory. However, there are some derivatives of sort of pulling from that thinking that what I was going to ask about, and I do think it's related to critical race theory, and I'm curious how Bob Moses would have thought about sort of classic liberalism, because one of the things, and I've made this point, we have a local state or a Kentucky state representative who has introduced or co-sponsored a bill that hasn't quite made it to the floor yet, I don't think, but is anti-CRT kind of thing, and I urged her, like, look, I don't think that critical race theory, I'm critical of critical race theory in some of the things that it does. I do think it helps us answer or ask some important questions, but to the extent to which anybody, either as critical race theorists or a somebody who is derivative of that or pulling from that or sort of sympathetic from that, might be illiberal in the sense of their ideas are not subject to inquiry or question. That to me seems to be a problem, and I'm seeing that on the right and the left, whether it's critical race theory or patriotism or some version of that, right? So that's where I urged our state legislator. I said, instead of banning critical race theory or whatever that might look like, why? It seems to me a better way is to say we want to ensure and advocate for what we would say is what I am calling liberal science, pulling from the work of Jonathan Rauch. I don't know if you're familiar with him, and Kindly Inquisitors and his new book Constitution of Knowledge, and I'm a big fan, right? So that all ideas are constantly open to scrutiny, whether it's 1619 Project, which I think asks an interesting question. What if we thought of the beginning of the country in 1619? Whether or not you think that's true, it's an interesting question to ponder, right?
Right.
And so advocating for liberal science, that we are always putting all of the ideas, and that's what historians do, right? We look at the ideas and, is this true? How true is this? And what are the downstream ramifications of that? And of course, the other piece is, no one person has sort of personal moral authority. There is no one person that has all the answers. And so if we would focus on that and advocating for that in all of our schools, which is consistent with inquiry, which is consistent with, I would guess, Bob Moses, the way that he would think about things, I do find, again, on the right and the left, but if we want to look at some of the left, racism, anti-racism, and having that binary, therein lies some of that friction of a liberalism that shows up where you are either all right or all wrong, and nothing is even a question about whether or not this person or that person is right or something like that can be met with absolute, I mean, on social media they'll shred you, or some version of that. So how would Bob Moses, or did he think about sort of classic liberalism and sort of the idea of illiberalism, as it were, do you think?
Yes, well, that's great. That's great statement. Well, first of all, I'd love to find out more about the liberal science that you're. If
Constitution of Knowledge is Jonathan Rauch's latest book, and he basically follows on from Kindly Inquisitors from '93, which is stunningly like it. I said it's like a time capsule predicting the future, because anti-racism is in there. I mean, it's a really, really fascinating work. But anyways,
I'll have to. I'm familiar with some other work by him, but not.
Yeah.
So I'll have to check those out.
Mm-hmm.
Bob would be the first to say that people need to be free to ask any question. And the idea that someone, it's really serious what's going on. I mean, again, when I talk about moral excess, I mean,
Right.
I'm of the left. I grew up in the left. I'm very much part of the left. But unfortunately, just like I think there's more moral excess on the right,
Mm-hmm.
much more. But there's troubling moral excess on the left. And that chilling effect I'll just give you an example of
Mm-hmm.
a colleague of mine who teaches psychology at Williams College. When I was asking him, why don't Williams students speak up more? Why are they so quiet? You'd
Mm-hmm.
think they'd be talking all the time. And because that was my experience when I taught there, was that and he said it's because they're afraid. They're afraid that they're going to say the wrong thing. They're afraid that they're going to get attacked for.
Right.
And a lot of faculty are
Mm-hmm.
afraid about this too.
Mm-hmm.
And he gave the example of a seminar that he was in, where a student mentioned somebody as being I think a rape victim,
Mm-hmm.
and a student jumped on that student and said, "You cannot use the term victim. You cannot use the term victim.
Right.
It's a survivor. It's a survivor, a rape survivor."
Mm-hmm.
And really, made that person feel guilty, and so on and so forth. That's just totally unacceptable,
Right.
as far as I'm concerned. And so this chilling effect where people are afraid, and I know, even as someone who is deeply involved with the Black community, and actually most of my students are African American, even so, I sometimes hesitate to ask certain questions of my
Right.
students because of that fear. Sometimes I try to go out of my way to to ask those kinds of questions. It's a real problem, and certainly, if you talk about the spirit of inquiry, I mean, it kills the spirit of inquiry.
Right.
And this whole question of moral absolutism on the right, but also on the left, and it goes back a long way. It's deadly. I mean, because moral absolutes are one thing. I mean, there are certain moral absolutes like human rights, as far as I'm concerned, but moral absolutism, this view that certain things are so sacrosanct that you can't even question them,
Mm-hmm.
And sure, there are some things that you would not want to, like lynching, for instance, but there are some things that are in this sort of gray area where
Right.
we're not really sure whether it's something we can talk about or not, or certain, like white people talking about dysfunction in the Black community. It's sort of like that's a no-no,
Right.
White people can't ask. Well, that's just not helpful in the long run, at least,
Right.
to feel like we can't ask certain kinds of questions. It matters how we ask those questions.
Right.
It matters. We have to, ask those questions in a humble way, and in a compassionate way. But
Genuine spirit of curiosity.
listening, which was
Right.
more than anything. If there's one word to encapsulate Bob Moses' philosophy of teaching, it was listening.
Mm-hmm.
Listening to the kids, listening to the teachers. So I'm just very, very troubled by that. And I have students now, I teach adult students in this PhD program, and there are people stay quiet because they don't want to get jumped on. They don't want to get called a racist. And
Yeah.
so one thing that I like about Ibram Kendi's perspective in his book, How to Be an Anti-Racist, is that he's saying, let's not make racism be this bad word, that people are afraid to use. And he says, what people say about racism, what they feel, that doesn't matter. What matters is to take actions that are anti-racist. And I really embrace that perspective, that there are all these questions about, what's racist or what's not racist, but the where the rubber hits the road is what you decide to do in your own life to oppose racism, either by challenging people who make racist comments or by trying to establish policies that are anti-racist, locally or nationally. So that is, in other words, people ought to feel free, and people should feel free to say what they want to say about racism or anti-racism, but at a certain point, then the important thing is to act.
Right.
And King would say this too. And so to figure out, okay, well, what can you all agree on might be an anti-racist action to take. But to be so caught up, and this is one of the problems with moral excess on the left, is language, that the language is so overvalued. And maybe this is something that Ibram Kendi was reacting to, was the fact that people on the left, they're so, and some of it's very esoteric, in the academic world. It's not something that most people could even understand,
right.
Terms, but so much of it's about language, and so he's saying, let's cut to the chase, let's say what we need to say, but ultimately it's the action that we take against racism that really matters.
Yeah, it is. The things that you've pointed out, I think are really, really problematic. A sense of illiberalism and sort of chilling of speech and thought, and I think it's happening on both left and right. I find it really interesting in ways that people, depending on where I'm interacting, I might ask questions and push back, because I try to get people to think about things. And I might ask somebody, when somebody says, an educator says on Twitter, you're either racist or anti-racist, and I say, which anti-racism, right? I mean, because it is a complexity that needs to be explored, and those conversations sometimes result in, you sound kind of like a racist. And okay, one of those things that I think we have to be comfortable with if we're going to sort of travel in this cognitive space, in this conversational space, this dialogue, is when somebody says something to you or calls you something, be it a racist, that you don't respond as though you are just violently angry, but say, interesting. What makes you say that? All right. And on the other side of the conversation, if I ask somebody who is clearly coming from the right and making a pretty broad sweeping generalization, I might say, a similar question, and I have had people say on that side, you're my liberal friend, whereas the other side says, I think you must listen to too much Fox News, and it is a strange dynamic to be sort of politically non-binary or homeless in that way, right? But the sense of like continually trying to understand and be understood, and not so much trying to prove you're right and to prove to everybody else how you're right. And to me, that's an aim of liberal education that we I think, have gotten away from in many ways over the past several decades. I might trace it back to A Nation at Risk in 1983, pushing us more towards accountability and testing in scores, which is an interesting wrinkle in the sort of pragmatic and utilitarianism of somebody, as you've described it with Bob Moses, thinking about how do we get these kids to a place of upward mobility, and the sort of pragmatism of really focusing on things like STEM, right? And I'm curious if in his later life, because we've talked more about his earlier sort of pieces of work, was he very vocal on any of the more recent educational pieces of testing and accountability, or any of the education pieces later in his life that were notable?
Yeah, well, that's great, and I think there's an ambiguity there. If he had his way, he would not have that kind of standardized testing. But on the other hand, he understood early on that was there, and it wasn't going to change anytime soon. And so he adapted to that. And so the Algebra project was really aimed at getting kids from inner city or poor backgrounds to be able to master algebra through this bottom-up approach, this socially constructive approach, through experiential learning, basically. I mean, it was all about learning algebra through experiential learning. And then he writes about, in his book called Radical Equations, it came out about 20 years ago, he writes about how the kids did incredibly well on those standardized tests. So in a way, he was teaching to the test, which I don't know if he would deny that or not, but I mean, in fact, he was teaching to the test, because that was the benchmark. That was the aim, for them to be able to do well on those tests, so that then they could then take the higher level of math and get up to calculus and all that. So,
and algebra is a very significant gate for lots of kids, and especially for underprivileged, underserved, or whatever.
You have to know any STEM field. You have to know algebra, and since the test, now he would wish that there were other ways of measuring it, that there were ways of measuring his particular approach.
It also keeps some kids from just graduating, not just STEM and being successful in those career fields, but just graduation.
Right. What I don't know, and I'd like to find out, is what efforts Bob might have made, or how he might have spoken out about testing, which I'm very much against myself. I mean, it just it might have served a purpose for a while, but it ultimately it was. I think it's very damaging, and I think he may have tried to figure out alternative ways of measuring, but he clearly must have felt that there had to be ways to measure mathematical literacy. That, because otherwise, how do you know if what you're doing is working? How do you know if you're really having the effect that you're having? And so, since there really wasn't any other sort of structured way of measuring kids' proficiency in algebra and math generally, those tests were, at least some measure of that.
Right.
Now, I just want to say briefly that in the last 20 years of his life, Bob's campaign was, he always saw the Algebra Project as an organizing campaign that not only would teach kids algebra and STEM skills, but also would help to ultimately revolutionize education, so that in other fields as well, there'd be ways that kids could get, whether it was history or languages or whatever it might be, where kids could really learn what they were not learning because of the poor schooling. And so he initiated this effort about 20 years ago for a campaign for a constitutional amendment for quality education as a constitutional right, not just K through 12, but college as well. And in the context of that, you have to think about, how do you define quality, and how do you measure it? And so, in fact, he edited a book with articles, essays about quality education as a constitutional right, looking at these issues of, how would education have to be transformed in order for it to be able to be a constitutional amendment or a constitutional guarantee? How would the quality have to be transformed? And so that's where, in order to make quality education a constitutional right, you have to make it quality education first or along the way. And so that's what he was doing with the Algebra project, was making, creating microcosms of quality education, which then when they go to, fight for this national amendment, they'd be able to say, well, this is what it would look like. And not just in algebra, but maybe in languages, maybe he also worked with physics teachers and chemistry teachers to incorporate this bottom-up experiential learning approach for those fields as well. So you couldn't just have a constitutional guarantee for quality education without making it, showing how it would have to be quality education.
Interesting. Well, I'm mindful of time, and I definitely want to give you an opportunity to share links and resources, but I do have one question, at least one question. I have many questions, but one question I think is perhaps important to think about. One of the things, and we've referenced Martin Luther King Jr. several times, and of course his speech in Washington being iconic, and the most famous line of content of the character, that kind of thing, which gets used, misused, and all of those things as in this discourse and dialogue sometimes. But I do really like the idea. I think I first came across this example in Coddling of the American Mind by Jonathan Haidt and Greg Lukianoff of circles, right? That the idea is sort of moral excesses, I think, on the right and the left, of drawing ever smaller circles of your in-group and excluding those, right? Those are them, this is us, and that us versus them, which is in sort of real conflict with Dr. King's, content of a character and shared humanity and all of those things. Right. The idea that we certainly all have immutable characteristics, and we all have things that make us different, and we should celebrate those things, but we also need to not take our eye off the ball of our shared humanity, and Black Lives Matter because they are humans, and just like we all are. And so I'm curious how Bob Moses might have either articulated anything like that similarly, or thought about it differently.
Well, can you just restate? I'm not sure exactly what the question is.
Well, just the ways in which I'm just curious about the ways in which Bob Moses might have been in the same line of thinking. I'm assuming that he would be, but I don't want to assume because I don't know his work particularly well, or any distinctions that he might have made in that sort of content of a character kind of spirit.
Yeah, he certainly would have believed that. Of course, character, he was all about character. A lot of what he was trying to do, and what he was trying to do through the Algebra project, it was not just, it was really about the whole person, the whole kid. It was all about their character, and trying to build up their character, raising their self-esteem, self-confidence, which could be a way of strengthening their character and the values that he believed in. So he would have, part of the character that he would be advocating would be someone who is empowered enough to not to ask questions, but also to stand up, to be what King called a transformed nonconformist. Or King talked about how we need more people to be creatively maladjusted to this society. He said we need an international, sort of tongue-in-cheek, he said we need an international society of creative maladjustment. We need people. Well, but then it wasn't just to be a nonconformist, but a transformed nonconformist. So not to show off, not to draw attention to yourself, but because you have to stand up for your beliefs. And so Bob would really have encouraged students to stand up for things, even though they might be in a group that has some measure of groupthink in it, a group where they would not want to hear these questions, but that these be as part of the strength of their character, the kids, the adults, would stand up for things that might be very unpopular. An example of this is going back to Mississippi, the Mississippi movement. After when Bob Moses came up with this idea for Mississippi Freedom Summer, there were activists who said, we don't want all those white kids, all those white college students coming down here. Essentially they were saying this is a black movement, and we can't let that. I mean, that would just really damage us and damage the empowerment of these local black people to have all these smart white kids from the north to come down, and they would feel like the white kids were telling them what to do and so on. And Bob Moses said, he said we're not going to be racist. He said we're not going to be racist. This is not going to be a racist movement. He saw that as racist.
Interesting.
And he said that to these really tough organizers black organizers that he was working with. One person who agreed with him, because he was in the minority, one person who strongly agreed with him was Fannie Lou Hamer, who said, it's got to be inclusive. We got to bring those white kids down here. We've got to show them what it's like here in Mississippi. We've got to spread the message across the country. So he won that battle, but he had to stand up and basically accuse his comrades who had risked their lives and of being racist, and so the anti-racist step for him was to make this an inclusive movement, a black and white movement. The idea that SNCC, as it later became, a separatist movement under Stokely Carmichael, that was just anathema to him. One of the reasons he left SNCC, because he considered that to be racist. So he really, he was really willing always to stand up for some very controversial beliefs, and that was part of his courage as well. It wasn't just in the face of white supremacists, standing up to white supremacists who were trying to kill him, but standing up to black activists who had this, moral absolutism, and who insisted on an all-black movement, sort of the black nationalist perspective, which is very understandable,
right,
but wouldn't get us anywhere and didn't get us anywhere. And so it has to be more inclusive. It has to be a very broad alliance, interracial alliance, if we're gonna really be able to survive climate change. This is my view. I imagine it was probably Bob's too, but we're going to have to build a interracial alliance like we've never seen before, or else we're just not going to survive. We've got to put aside some of these, they're important things, but we have to put aside some of these sort of absolutist views. At least put them on hold, because we got to stop the world from basically being destroyed by global warming.
Yeah. Well, again, I'm mindful of time, and I think I could talk more about this for quite some time, but
well, I'd love to continue the conversation.
Yeah, as I came into this conversation, I was very largely unaware of the work of Bob Moses, and now I'm very regrettable. So now one of my questions is, where can I find out more? I know you have some books. One of them is on the Montgomery bus boycott, and let me make sure I get the title right here, because I'm looking at your Amazon page. Daybreak of Freedom, and then you also have To the Mountaintop, which is about Martin Luther King Jr. Those I'm sure are interesting. Other places that we could or should go to find out more about Bob Moses.
Yeah, well, let me just mention that my book, Montgomery of Daybreak of Freedom, was made into an HBO, a really superb HBO film called Boycott, which I would highly recommend to people. But that's not about Bob Moses. I do talk about Bob Moses a lot in my biography of King, To the Mountaintop. But his book, I've done a lot of writing about Bob Moses recently and the Mississippi movement, but it's going to be published, in some form, but not yet. But I would highly recommend his book. It's called Radical Equations, and then the subtitle is Civil Rights from Mississippi to the Algebra Project, by Robert P. Moses, published by Beacon Press quite a while ago, 2020 years ago. 20 years ago. but it's very it's so relevant. I mean, that's, and then the other book that he collaborated with others called Quality Education as a Constitutional Right. Quality Education as a Constitutional Right. It's a number of essays by well-known educators, some of whom you no doubt know or know of, but including Bob Moses. And that campaign hopefully will, someday get some legs.
Yeah, well, it's stunning when one really looks at the disparities in the educational experiences across our country, and it's just like, how in the heck is that even tenable? But folks have there's lots of things in place that make that the way that they are, and again, that would be a whole other conversation, and should be a whole other conversation. But I would like you to also, I know you have the social justice work that you're doing there. What are the links and places where they should find any of the work that you're doing?
Sure, I can just send those to you.
Yeah, and we'll put those in the show notes. But just so that there's a sort of a verbal placeholder, you're at Union, and then just a quick overview of that, so that folks would know what they're looking for when they click on that link. What the social justice work, what do you actually do, and just an elevator pitch for it, I suppose.
Right. The social justice, it's actually the Institute for Social Justice at an institute and university, which until 6 or 8 months ago, we hadn't really fleshed out what the institute part of that was. So under our current president, Karen Webb, we've created an Institute for Social Justice. We're making that real, and so it's very much at the early stages. And what I'm doing right now with you is, part of our efforts to get the word out. We decided that after Bob Moses died a few weeks ago, that we wanted to make a major effort to sort of honor his legacy and his work. And so I've been very much involved in that. But the idea is to do educational work of all kinds around an array of social justice issues, defining social justice broadly. And so it might be, for instance, we're going to probably do a program on Haiti, because we have some people at Union who are expert on Haiti and the catastrophes there. But also it's definitely a work in progress at the moment, but this will extend into a lot of different areas. My twin concerns really are racial justice and climate change. I think we've got to connect those two. I think that in order to build the kind of coalition we need to really fight climate change, we have to overcome our racial divides, because we have to bring people together to fight this this common catastrophe that we're all facing. So we'll be involved in all of those. I would say, just in brief, that we're focusing on racial justice, economic justice, and environmental justice. Those are the three primary areas, but also how they're intertwined. They're all intertwined, they're all interdependent. And so you can't really focus on one without focusing on the others. This is what King said, as well. So it's all these things, not seeing them overcoming the single issue approach, which doesn't really get us anywhere, but seeing how these serious crises, the storm of crises that we're facing, it's all interrelated. And so we have to get a larger picture of the whole, whole situation, and not just get so focused on racial justice, let's say, that we lose sight of climate justice, or we lose sight of economic justice. So at the Institute, we're really trying to focus on how all these systemic injustices are interwoven, because only then can we figure out strategies for overcoming systemic injustice. in all these areas.
And the Institute, to the extent that you've developed this at this point, would be if I'm looking for an undergraduate program, or maybe are there one-off courses that one might take, or are there graduate studies, or is it outside of, or is it totally different?
Yeah. Well, it's outside of the academic side of the university, but we are offering certificates. Right now, a certificate in social justice, a certificate in workplace justice, a certificate in social justice in healthcare or among first responders, and then a fourth certificate in sort of, experiential learning, I guess you could call it, where we would ally with, or we would focus on a particular organizing campaign. One of our students created and is leading an effort in Atlanta to provide portable wash basins for homeless people. And so there will always be at least one actual organizing campaign that people, and these would be mainly adult learners, but not necessarily, and they could get one of these certificates in any one of these areas. But it's not only about certificates. That's the other side of it, is to produce research, produce studies on all of these various issues. We have a group called the editorial board that I serve on, which is mostly PhD faculty, and we're going to kind of watch over how we could produce really solid research, really looking at the kind of questions, the very important questions that you were raising, these really controversial questions, like about, how we avoid moral absolutism, how we try to find a way to develop a politics for social change that is open-minded and inclusive. It's got to be inclusive. It can't be alienating people. We have to accept people on their own terms and then have these conversations, which is what I do in my classes with my adult students, is we have interracial dialogues and that sort of thing to try to get beyond these sticking points.
Right. Well, you've been generous with your time, and we're getting over an hour and a half here, so I want to wrap us up. But I'm a better man for this conversation, and I've now have a renewed interest, and we'll be looking into the work of Bob Moses a bit more, and certainly hope the folks who have listened to this point will do the same, because it sounds like he is certainly consistent and resonant with a lot of the work that we do. So, Stewart, I really appreciate the time and the conversation.
Well, I certainly appreciate it, and it's been great. It's been great talking with you, and you certainly have all the important questions, and a lot of your experience, comes through with the way you talk about it, so eloquently.
That'll do it for today's podcast episode. Thanks again for tuning in. Don't forget to review us and share us on your network so we can grow our audience to better meet your needs. Also, don't forget to find us on our websites, TeachThought.com and WeGrowTeachers.com, as well as our various social media outlets.